I'm in my kitchen, and I'm lighting a yurtsite candle for my mother, as I've been doing for the past 38 years. I'll recite a prayer, and for the next 24 hours, her flame will flicker. My mother. I'm watching my mother, and she's wearing pajamas and white ankle socks, and she has, each arm is around one of my grandparents' shoulders, and her feet are kind of hanging, and it looks like she's on point, but she's not doing ballet. Actually, her toes are dragging across the floor as my grandparents walk her across the living room. And I'm like 7 years old, and I'm watching this, and I don't know what's going on, but my grandparents are here, so I feel safe. And they tell me that everything's okay. My mother's having an episode. She has these every so often, like sometimes like this, like when she can't walk, or sometimes her fingers, she can't button her blouse, she fumbles, and sometimes she just has double vision. We call them episodes. But my mother has multiple sclerosis, MS, and she's had it ever since I was a baby. My mother was born and raised in Brooklyn, and I know that when she was 16, she graduated high school because she skipped a couple grades, and then she went up to Hunter College in Manhattan, and then she dropped out. But I don't know when she dropped out. I don't know why she quit. Sometimes I wonder, I don't even know who her friends were or what she did for fun. I mean, my dad told me his stories. I know that my dad ran with this gang of Jewish guys in Boston, and they played pool and they played poker, and then they went out and had corned beef sandwiches afterwards. But I don't know my mother's stories. I don't know. I do know that somewhere, I guess between dropping out of college and marrying my dad, she worked for Revlon in Manhattan. And she would talk about how she would get dressed up, and she'd go to, it was on 57th Street, and she'd go into the office. I don't know what she did. And she knew the lipstick colors before they came out. And when she told this to us, she was beaming, She would do this. And I kind of felt bad for her, because it seemed like she liked that life, better than she liked with our family. And I also felt kind of mad at her, because it seemed like she liked that life better than being with our family. And the MS didn't just affect her motor skills. For example, I think it was about 9, we were driving home, we were doing errands. My mother was driving me and my sister were in the back seat, and my mother was driving it, and I had a hat. I took it off. And I was just twirling the hat, I was playing with it, and it just flew right out the window. And I looked at my sister, and I looked at my mother, who was driving. She didn't see anything. But I was like, oh my God, I know what's going to happen when I get home. I know my mother is going to get so angry. She's going to scream, and she's going to yell, and she's going to say, fucking kids, and you fucking kids. And I don't even know where she learned that word. But she was so frustrated, and she was scary. I wasn't afraid she was going to hit me, but she just seemed so, she got hysterical. She was hysterical. I would sometimes hear that Rolling Stones song, 19th Nervous Breakdown, and I think, that's my ma. She had tranquilizers in the kitchen cabinet. And sometimes after dinner, she would sit at the kitchen table, and she would just cry and cry. And she'd say that she was useless and that she was a burden to the family. And I'm like a kid. I'm like, no, you're not, Ma. No, I didn't know what to say. And then sometimes she was perfectly fine. She was in a bowling league, and she was really active in the temple, and she played mahjong. She'd have the ladies over once a week, and they'd sit at this little fold-out table in the living room, and they would smoke cigarettes, and they would laugh, and they would dip their Wise potato chips in that Lipton's onion soup and sour cream dip. And she was happy. She was confusing. She wasn't confusing. She was sick. And I was so angry at her for being sick. I was so mad at her. I hated her for being sick. I wanted her to be like my friends' mothers. I wanted her to like take me shopping or take me to lunch, and we could talk. I could like tell her what's going on at school and what I'm doing, and like maybe she could tell me, I don't know, tell me her stories about her. And I love stories. I like hearing people's stories, knowing about their lives. When I was in grade school, the library had this summer reading program, and I would go to the library, I'd get a book, and I'd have to go to the librarian, and I'd have to stand in front of her and give her an oral report, and I would get a sticker to put on a map. And I remember my very first 3 books: Louisa May Alcott, Newt Rockne, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Biographies, people's stories. I wanted to know her story. I knew more about my grandparents, her parents, than my mother. My grandparents lived in New York, and we lived in Boston. And pretty much like once a month, my grandparents would drive up to Boston to visit us, or we would drive down to New York. And when we would drive to New York, we'd like pull up in front of the apartment building. There would be my grandmother, my Bubby, sitting in the window, just sitting in the window waiting for us to pull up. I don't know how she knew. We didn't get off the road and make a phone call, right? I used to think that maybe just Bubby got up and just sat there in front of the window. And I would go into the apartment, and it smelled like fried onions and brisket. It was just so familiar. I mean, it was Bubby's house. And I would go into the second bedroom, and I'd put my stuff down on the bed, only it wasn't a bed. It was really this green plaid plastic, like beach cot. I mean, like I slept on it like it was a bed, but it wasn't a bed. It was just a green plastic beach cot. And it was uncomfortable, but I was with my grandparents, so I didn't care. At dinner, Bubby didn't eat. Bubby would basically sit on the edge of her seat, and she'd kind of like look around at everybody's plate, right? And she'd see if you were maybe almost done, she'd want to come around with more food, and you'd be like, Bubby, I'm full, I'm not hungry anymore. And Bubby would say, you don't have to be hungry to eat. It was the same thing in the morning. We'd be sitting around, having our bagels. Bubby would be wearing her apron. She'd be at the edge of her seat, and she'd be watching. And then she would say to my dad, Paul, his name was Paul, Paul, you want some more coffee? In her, like, adopted, well, she had developed a New York accent, even though her native language was Russian. Now, I knew my grandparents came from Russia, and that's all I knew. To me, they were just my grandparents, and they always lived in New York. And I loved those weekends. And you know, my mother was happy, and she was calm. Summer I graduated high school. My grandparents did what a lot of Jewish grandparents from New York did. They moved to Fort Lauderdale. Highlight, the community clubhouse, the community pool, and early bird specials. Right before I just graduated high school, so before I went to college, I flew down to Florida, and I spent a week with my grandparents. And I would spend the day at the pool. At 4:30, of course, was dinner. And we'd come home from dinner, and then Bubby would empty her purse, and there would be like these dinner rolls wrapped in napkins, and all these sweet and low packets. And she'd look at the dinner rolls and be like, those would be good for breakfast. I would watch Jeopardy, Wheel of Fortune, we'd play gin rummy, and about 9 o'clock we'd have Nescafe instant decaf coffee and Bubby's homemade rugelach. I'm 17. Now, if I were back home in Boston, I would be driving around with the girls, we'd be blasting the radio, and we'd be heading off to the cornfields to drink our Boone's Farm Strawberry Hill that we had in paper bags under the car seat. But I'm here with I'm 17. I'm here with my grandparents, and I love it. Now, the last night of my visit, Bubby brings out a box of photos and a couple of albums. And I'm looking at these pictures, and I see Bubby. She's got like long, dark hair and braids. And my grandfather's got like striped knee socks on and knickers. And they're with their friends, a lot of friends, and they're posing. They all pose in front of a rock, or they like poke their heads out from behind some hedges. I mean, this was the 1920s. This was 100 years ago. They took all these pictures. I mean, their social media was scalloped edge black and white photos that they sent to the developer that took 3 weeks to develop, that they took on one of those Kodak fold-out cameras where you didn't know whether to take pictures or play a polka, like an accordion. And I'm looking at these photos, and I see my grandparents, like, they were kids, they had a different life. They weren't just grandparents that lived in New York. And then they start giving me these things, like Bubby gave me the passports that they had when they first came over to this country. And they gave me the marriage ketubah. And they start telling me these stories. Like Bubby lived on Ellis Island. And when they gave her white bread, she thought it was cake. She didn't know. And my grandfather, when he came here, he was 16, and they put him in the 5th grade with a bunch of 10-year-olds, so he just dropped out. And I'm listening to these stories. They're giving me pieces of themselves. And then I see pictures of my mother when she was a kid. And like I can put my hands around, the hair and the clothes, and all you see are the eyes and the nose and the mouth. That's my face. I have my mother's face. But it's like all I have from her. My grandparents, they're giving me pieces of themselves. They're giving me like their biographies, their stories. And I'm looking at these pictures of my mother, and I know that there's a story behind for that little girl. I don't know. "38 years ago, my dad came home from work, and the garage door was closed, and my mother's car was inside and it was running. So I stand in my kitchen, and I'm lighting a yurtside candle for my mother, as I've been doing for the past 38 years. And I'll recite a prayer, and I'll wonder about my mother. And for 24 hours, her flame will flicker.